What would a sentry know about fire? The man who said it was young and loud and very sure of himself, and he said it standing 6 feet from a guardsman who had loaded more powder in his life than that whole crew would touch in 10 festivals. I was that guardsman's partner on the river terrace that night, and I have told this story badly 100 times since, because the part that matters is not the part people want to hear. They want the sky. I want you to understand the man who was watching it before anyone else thought to. His name was Havard Crane. He had stood the festival posts of Aldermere for 11 years that I knew of, and he was the kind of guard the tourists photographed without ever wondering about, tall under the bearskin, red wool brushed to a deep clean color, white gloves, the rifle at the carry, eyes forward, and still as a man cut from the same gray stone as the river wall. I was Daniel Ferris then, 3 years on the posts and still young enough to think stillness was the easy part of the job. I learned otherwise that night with everyone else. The festival was the long light, the great midsummer celebration that closes when the dark finally comes down over the water and the royal fireworks open above the Queen's reach. Half the kingdom comes for it. The river terrace below the palace fills with families on blankets, the bridges fill, the far bank fills, and out on the black water a barge sits anchored with the firing frames built across it, the racks and mortars, and the long lines that carry the festival's whole closing spectacle. It is the single most watched quarter hour in Aldermere. Children wait all year for it. I had stood the terrace post twice before and thought of the fireworks the way the crowd did, as a thing that simply happened, beautiful and finished, somebody else's work arriving in the sky. Havard did not think of it that way. That was the first thing the crew got wrong about him, and the last thing they understood. We came on post at the 7th hour, while the light was still gold and long across the water, and the firing barge was being made ready 40 yards out. The Festival Pyrotechnics Company had the contract that year. A sharp, modern outfit, all matching jackets and a great deal of confidence, brought in to replace the old Palace Fire Masters team that everyone said was too slow and too cautious and too expensive. The new crew worked the racks on the barge and ran a second firing station on the terrace itself, at a roped enclosure not 30 feet from our post, where their controller sat behind a panel of switches and a laptop that fed the whole sequence. Havard watched them work. He did it the way he watched everything, without seeming to move his head, but I had been beside him long enough to know the difference between a guard looking at a crowd and a guard looking at a problem. By the time the gold light went amber, he was looking at a problem. "They've crossed 2 leads," he said to me, very low, the way we talk on post without our lips appearing to move. "On the near rack, the angled mortars." I did not know what a crossed lead was. I said so, the way you do at 3 years in. "The firing wires," he said. "From the panel to the shells. They've run 2 of them across each other and tied them to the same rail. If one shorts in the damp off the river, it can carry to the other. 2 shells go when the panel calls for 1. A pause, his eyes never leaving the enclosure. And the angled mortars on that rack are canted 3, maybe 4 degrees off true, toward the terrace, toward us." "Maybe that's how it's set," I said. "It is not how it's set," Havard said. "Not over a crowd. You can't the angled work out over open water, away from the people, every time, no exceptions, because a tube can lift in the rack when it fires and a tube that lifts throws its shell wherever it's pointed. Those are pointed at the bank." He was quiet a moment. "Somebody set that rack to make a prettier picture from the royal box and didn't think about the bounce." I want to be fair to the crew. They were not fools and they were not villains. They were good at the part of the work that shows the colors, the timing, the great cascading finale that makes 100,000 people gasp at once. They had done a dozen city festivals and nothing had ever gone wrong, and that is a dangerous number of times for nothing to go wrong, because it teaches a man that nothing ever will. The young loud one was their lead technician. Brennan, his jacket said. He ran the terrace panel, and he carried himself like a man who had never once been told he was mistaken about anything that mattered. Havard waited until the crew took a break before the final checks. Then he did a thing I had not seen him do in 3 years on the posts beside him. He spoke first, to a civilian, on duty. He did not leave his post, understand that. He turned his head, only that, and pitched his voice to carry the 30 feet to the enclosure, level and quiet and entirely without heat. The angled rack on the near barge frame is canted toward the bank, he said, and you've 2 leads crossed on the same rail. I'd check both before you arm it. You would have thought he had walked into the enclosure and spat on the panel. Brennan turned around slowly. He looked at the bearskin and the white gloves and the rifle, and he smiled the way a man smiles when he has just been handed something he intends to enjoy. "Did the statue talk?" he said, loud enough that 2 of his crew laughed. "It talks." "Check the leads," Havard said, "nothing else." "You want to tell me about my fireworks?" Brennan came to the rope. He was enjoying himself enormously now, playing to his crew and to the families near enough to hear. "You stand here in your costume 8 hours a day not moving, and you want to come and tell me about pyrotechnics. What would a sentry know about fire?" He spread his arms to the racks, the panel, the whole humming apparatus of his trade. "I've put up shows in 6 cities. You hold a rifle you've never fired at a parade. Stick to standing still, soldier. Leave the clever part to the people who understand it." Havard's face did not change. It never did. His eyes had already gone back forward, out over the water, off the man entirely, and that, I came to understand, was not Havard accepting the insult. It was Havard deciding the man was not the problem he needed to watch. The man would still be a fool in 10 minutes. The rack would be lethal in 10 minutes. He gave his attention to the thing that could kill someone. But Brennan was not finished, because men like Brennan are never finished while there is a crowd. "Tell you what," he called over, grinning, "you keep watch on the dangerous statues and I'll handle the explosives. Deal? Don't strain yourself." A few people laughed. Most didn't. There is always a portion of any crowd that is embarrassed for the man making the scene. But enough laughed that Brennan felt himself the winner, and went back inside the rope to his panel, pleased with the world. One of his crew, an older man with gray in his stubble who had been quiet through all of it, glanced once at the angled rack and then once at Havard, and I saw something cross his face. But he said nothing. The lead technician had spoken. The lead stayed crossed. The rack stayed canted at the bank. "He didn't check it," I said. "No," Havard said. "You could go to the sergeant. Have the officer of the festival stop the show until they look." "On what?" he said quietly. "On the word of a sentry against the company that holds the contract, 15 minutes before the close, with the box full and the whole bank waiting." He let that sit. "They'd ask the company. The company would say the rack is fine. The company believes the rack is fine. By the time anyone with authority walked out to that barge and made them prove it, the show would be over." He shifted his weight a half-inch, the only sign that any of this cost him anything. "I'll watch it. If it goes wrong, it'll go wrong on the angled rack, and it'll go in the first minute when they fire the opening volley hot. I'll be looking at the angled rack." I remember thinking that was a strange and almost arrogant thing for him to say. "I'll be looking at the angled rack," as though one man watching could do anything against a barge of powder 40 yards out on black water. I did not yet know who I was standing next to. None of them did. That was the whole of it, really. They had all decided what a sentry was and built their certainty on it, and not one of them, not Brennan, not the festival officers, not me, had asked the only question that mattered, which was, what did this particular man do before he came to stand still at our gate? I would have the answer before the night was out. So would the crew. So would the 100,000 people on the bank, though most of them never knew the name of the man who gave it to them. The dark came down the way it does at the long light, slow and then all at once, the gold going to rose, going to deep blue, going to black, the lamps along the terrace lit, the river a sheet of moving ink with the firing barge a low dark shape upon it. The crowd settled. The bridges packed solid. Up in the royal box the king and the queen took their places, and the whole bank went quiet in that held breath, way a great crowd does when it knows the best part is about to start. A bell rang from the barge. The crew took their stations. Brennan sat down at his terrace panel and put his hand near the master switch and looked very fine and capable in the lamplight, a young man at the center of 100,000 pairs of waiting eyes, and I will say this for him. At that moment, before any of it, I think most of the people watching would have traded places with him gladly. He had the best seat at the festival. He had the whole sky in his hand. Beside me, Havard had stopped watching the crowd entirely. He had stopped watching Brennan. His eyes were fixed on one thing, out on the dark water, the near-angled rack on the barge frame, the canted tubes, the crossed leads he could no longer even see in the dark but knew were there. His stillness had changed. I cannot explain it better than to say that for 3 years I had stood beside a man being still because the job required it, and now I was standing beside a man being still the way a drawn bow is still. Every part of him was already moving toward something. Only his body had not been told yet. "Daniel," he said, without turning his head. His voice had dropped into something flat and even and very fast, a register I had never heard him use. "When this opens, watch me, not the sky. If I move, you clear the rope line behind us and you get the families on the near blankets back from the wall. You don't ask me why. You move the second I do. Do you understand? Havard, what are you? Do you understand?" "Yes," I said. The bell rang twice from the barge. And Brennan, smiling, pressed the master switch and gave the sky to the crowd. The opening volley went up in a single great breath, a wall of gold and white that climbed and burst and filled the whole dark with light, and the crowd made the sound 100,000 people make when the year's most beautiful thing begins, a long rising sigh that turns into a cheer. For a heartbeat it was perfect. For a heartbeat Brennan was exactly the man he believed himself to be, and the sky was his, and every face on the terrace was tipped up and glowing in the gold. I did not see it. I was watching Havard. That is the only reason I can tell you any of it, because the one man on that terrace who was not looking at the sky was the man beside me, and the next morning when they pieced it together from the angles, what they found was exactly what he had told me at the 7th hour, when the light was still gold. A lead shorted on the damp near rack. It carried, the way he'd said it would, across the crossed wires on the same rail, and where the panel had called for 1 shell, 2 went. 2 angled mortars fired at once on a frame built to fire them in sequence, and the double charge lifted the near tube in its rack the way he'd said a hot firing could, tipped it the last few degrees off the small wrong cant it already carried, and a moment later there was a shell in the air that was not going where shells are meant to go at the long light. It did not climb. It went low and flat and fast off the barge, a thick orange spark trailing smoke, out over the black water toward the terrace, toward the bank, toward the wall, toward the near blankets where the families sat with their faces turned up to the gold, knowing nothing. Havard moved. I have tried for years to describe it, and I always fail, because it was so fast and so without panic that it did not look like alarm at all. It looked like a man who had already done the thing in his mind, and was only now letting his body catch up. He came off the post, the thing a guard does not do, the thing that is drilled out of you until the not doing is the deepest reflex you own. And he was 3 strides into the crowd before I understood he had gone, his rifle already slung, his voice already up and carrying in a great flat command that cut clean through the cheering. Down, everyone down, away from the wall. I did what he had told me to do. I did not ask why. I had the rope line cleared, and I was hauling the near blankets back from the river wall. A father, 2 children, an old woman who came up confused and frightened. And behind me, I heard Havard's voice doing in 10 seconds what no festival officer's whistle could have done in 2 minutes, because there is a way a soldier can pitch an order that the animal part of a crowd obeys before the thinking part has caught up. Faces came down off the sky. People dropped, pulled their children flat, scrambled back from the wall, and the low orange spark came in over the water trailing its smoke and its fuse, and the part of the crowd that had been directly under its line was no longer standing there. It struck the river wall. Not the people, the wall. The shell came down against the old stone parapet at the terrace edge, and the burst charge in it caught, and there was a flat hard crack and a gout of fire and sparks against the stone, a thing that at 6 feet would have burned and at 1 foot would have done far worse, going off against a wall that an instant before had had a family pressed up against it. Stone chips flew. Sparks rained down the face of the parapet and hissed out in the river. A woman screamed. A great ugly ripple of panic started to move through the near crowd, the kind that kills people on its own if it builds, the kind where 100,000 frightened bodies all decide to be somewhere else at once. And out on the barge, in the dark, a second thing had already gone wrong, and this was the thing that could have turned a bad night into the worst night in the history of the festival. The double firing had not just thrown one shell. It had lit the near-angled rack early out of sequence, hot, with a tube canted wrong and a fused train running into the heart of the frame, where the great closing charges sat racked and waiting. Smoke was pouring off the near frame now, in a way smoke is not supposed to pour at the long light, lit red from underneath, and I could see even from the bank that there was fire on the barge that did not belong to the show. The closing volley of the long light is the largest set of charges fired anywhere in the kingdom in a year. If the fire on that frame reached them, if the whole rack went at once, on a barge 40 yards off a packed terrace, instead of climbing in its careful sequence into the empty sky, it would not be fireworks anymore. It would be a single enormous blast at the level of the crowd, and the bridges, and the box where the king and queen sat. Brennan was on his feet at the panel. I will not pretend he froze out of cowardice. I think it was worse than fear. I think it was the particular paralysis of a man whose entire certainty has just been removed from under him in 1 second, who has spent his whole life being right, and has just been catastrophically wrong in front of 100,000 people, and whose mind has simply stopped. He was hammering the master cutoff and nothing was happening, because the fire on the barge no longer cared what his panel said. The electrical part of the show was finished. What was burning out there was burning on its own now, chemical and stupid and spreading, and there was no switch on the terrace that could reach it. "It won't stop," Brennan was saying to no one, to the panel, to the night. "It won't, the cutoff isn't, it won't stop." Havard came back through the scattering crowd at a dead run and went straight to the enclosure. He did not slow at the rope. He came over it. "The barge tender," he said to Brennan, "flat, fast. Is it still made fast at the terrace stair?" Brennan stared at him. "The small boat, the tender you ran your crew out on. Is it at the stair?" Not a question now, a demand, hard as the river wall, and it reached through whatever had closed over Brennan's mind and dragged one true answer out of him. Yes, the stair, it's at the... Havard was already moving. And here is the thing I want you to understand about that moment, the thing I did not understand until much later. He was not running toward the boat in a panic. He was running toward the boat because he had already, in the few seconds since the shell struck the wall, done a piece of arithmetic that no one else on that terrace could have done, because no one else on that terrace had spent the first half of his life doing exactly this. He had looked at the smoke coming off the near frame, and the way it was lit, and the rate it was building, and he knew, the way I know my own name, roughly how long that frame had before the fire reached the closing charges, and he knew it was long enough to do something and short enough that there was no time to find anyone to give him permission. I caught him at the head of the terrace stair. "Havard, you can't, that's a fire on a barge full of..." "I know exactly what it's full of," he said, and for the first time all night he looked at me, really looked, 1/2 second, and there was something in his face I had never seen on the post, because the post had never asked for it. "Daniel, I built racks like that for 9 years. I know the order they're charged in, and I know which lines to cut, and I know how long I have, and there is not one other man within a mile of this river who can say that sentence. So I am going to go and do the thing I am the only one here who can do. You are going to keep these people back from the water. Go." He went down the stair into the dark toward the little boat, in his red wool and his bearskin, a ceremonial guard from the festival terrace, and he cast off and took the oars and pulled out across the black water toward the burning barge, toward the one place on the whole river that every sane instinct in a body screams to move away from. And I stood at the top of the stair with my heart going like a drum and finally, far too late, asked myself the question Brennan should have asked at the 7th hour. What had this man done before he came to stand still at our gate? I could not go with him. He was right. Someone had to hold the bank, and the bank was coming apart. The near crowd was on its feet now, the panic moving through it in waves, people pushing back from the wall and into the people behind them, and a crowd that size folding in on itself is its own catastrophe. I got 2 of the festival officers and we made a line and we shouted and pushed and held, and we got the near families moving back in order instead of all at once, and slowly. It felt like an hour. It was perhaps 2 minutes. The worst of the panic eased into something that could be managed, because the second shell people had been braced for did not come, and a crowd that is not being hit a second time will, mostly, calm. But all the while I was watching the water, we all were. Word moves through a crowd faster than any whistle, and the word that moved through that one was that a guardsman, that one, the still one, the one in the tall hat, had taken a boat out to the burning barge alone. The whole terrace, even frightened, even pushing, kept turning its faces back to the dark river and the low red glow building on the water, and the little dark shape of a man rowing toward it. I will tell you what happened on the barge, but I have to tell you how I know it because I was not there. I know it from the older crewman with the gray stubble. His name was Orrin, and he had been on the barge that night running the far frame, and what he saw made him the one who, afterward, told the rest of us who Havard Crane was. He had recognized something in the way Havard spoke at the 7th hour. He had not been sure. He was sure by the end of it. Havard brought the tender alongside the barge on the upstream side, away from the burning frame, and came aboard the way Orrin said he had never seen a man come aboard a working barge, fast, low, already reading it, his eyes going straight to the heart of the thing. The near frame was well alight now, the fire running along the fused train and the spilled composition, lit red, throwing sparks, and the closing charges sat racked just beyond it. The great shells, the finale of the long light, more powder in one frame than most men see in a lifetime, and the fire perhaps 90 seconds from reaching the first of them. Orrin had been backing away from it. Every instinct he owned told him to get off the barge and into the water and away, and he is not ashamed of that, and he should not be, because it was the correct instinct for a man who did not know what to do. What stopped him was Havard's voice, that same flat, fast, certain register, saying his name. "You far-frame man, Orrin, is it your jacket, Orrin?" He had read the name off the jacket in the firelight. "I need 2 minutes of you, and then you go in the water and I won't blame you. Can you give me 2 minutes? And Orrin, who told me this with his eyes wet, said, he knew what he was doing. You could hear it. I'd worked fire 15 years and I'd never heard a man sound like that with a frame burning next to him, like it was a job, like he'd done it before. So I gave him the 2 minutes. What Havard did in those 2 minutes was not brave the way the crowd later told it, all fire and daring. It was the opposite of that. It was the most disciplined thing Orrin had ever watched a man do. He did not try to fight the fire on the near frame. He told Orrin plainly that the near frame was gone, that the shells already in it would fire and there was no stopping them, and that was all right, because the near frame was angled mostly, out over the water now that the lifted tube had fallen back, and the near frame going up over the river would frighten people and hurt no one. The near frame was not the danger. The danger was the fire crossing from the near frame to the closing rack, to the great charges, because the closing rack was not angled out over the water. It was set to climb straight up over the center of the reach, which on any normal night meant a glorious vertical finale, and on this night meant that if it all lit at once at barge level, it would go off straight into the bowl of the river where the bridges and the box and 100,000 people sat. So he did not fight the fire, he cut the bridge. There was a fused train, a chase, Orrin called it, running between the near frame and the closing rack, the line that on a normal night would have carried the firing in its careful sequence from one to the next. The fire was traveling that chase right now, eating toward the great charges. Havard went to it. He had no tools but the bayonet at his belt, and he used it, and he cut the chase, not in one place but in three, the way Orrin said you cut a line you truly mean to break, and he pulled the cut sections apart and threw the near end into the river, so the fire had nothing to cross on, and then he dragged the first two of the closing shells bodily out of the rack and over the side into the black water, soaking them dead, to widen the gap the fire would have to leap. He did it with the near frame burning 4 feet from his shoulder, sparks falling on the red wool, and Orrin said his hands never once fumbled, never once hurried in the way that drops things, because Orrin understood this now. The man had built and broken down 1,000 racks exactly like this one, and his hands knew the work the way mine know how to sling a rifle, below thinking, below fear, in the place where long training lives. The near frame fired. It went up the way Havard had said it would, out over the water, a ragged, ugly half-sequence of shells climbing crooked into the dark and bursting low and bright over the river, nothing like the planned spectacle, but over the water, away from the bank. The crowd flinched as one. And then they realized the bursts were going up and out, away from them, and that no fire was coming at the wall, and the terror started just barely to turn into something else. But the closing rack had not gone. The great charges sat dark and quiet in their frame with a 4-foot gap of cut chase and wet barge between them and the dying near fire, and the fire reached the edge of the gap and found nothing to cross on, and guttered and went out. Havard Crane had stood on a burning barge in his ceremonial reds, and taken the largest charge of powder in the kingdom out of the fire's reach with a bayonet in his bare gloved hands, and the closing volley of the long light never fired at all. Most of the 100,000 people on the bank went home that night believing the show had simply ended early because something had gone a little wrong. They did not know how wrong. They did not know that the dark, quiet end of the festival, the anticlimax everyone grumbled about on the bridges, was the single most merciful thing that had happened to them all year. Orrin stayed his 2 minutes and then some. He helped Havard drag the last of the loose composition off the near frame into the water and stamp out the spot fires on the deck, and when it was done and the barge was only smoking and not burning, the two of them sat down on the wet deck in the dark, and Orrin said the guardsman took off his bearskin for the first time all night and set it on his knees and just breathed, and his hands shook then, only then, after. The way a soldier's hands are allowed to shake once the work is finished, and never 1 second before. "Where did you learn that?" Orrin asked him. "No sentry knows that. No sentry on earth knows that." And Havard told him. Not all of it, not the way I'll tell you, but enough that Orrin understood. And when the harbor launches finally came out to the barge and brought them both back to the terrace stair, Orrin went straight to the festival officers and to the sergeant and to me, and he told us, because he said a man who would do that and then put his furry hat back on and try to walk quietly back to his post as if nothing had happened was not going to tell us himself, and somebody had to. So this is who had been standing at our gate. Before he was Havard Crane, the festival sentry, he had been Master Crane of the Royal Fireworks and Signals, the man who, for 9 years, had charged and laid and fired the closing volley of the long light himself. He was the old fire master's right hand, and then his successor, the one who built the racks on that very barge before there was a sharp modern company to take the contract from him. He had trained under the men who'd held the powder warrants for 2 generations. He had spent a season with the Signal Corps learning to throw light and message across miles of dark with flares and shutters and timed fire, and he had come back and made the long light the most beautiful quarter hour in the kingdom, year on year, and no one had ever once been hurt at it, because the man who built it was the kind of man who cants the angled rack out over the water every time, no exceptions, and runs no 2 leads crossed on the same rail, and never, ever lets the prettier picture from the box outrank the family on the near blanket. When the new company came in cheaper and faster and surer, the old team was let go. There is no scandal in it. It is only how these things go. Some of the team went to other cities. The old fire master retired. And Havard Crane, who had given the kingdom its fire for 9 years and did not want to take it anywhere else, did a thing that says everything about him. He stayed. He took the king's coin in the only other way a disciplined man of his years could, and he put on the red wool and the bearskin and went to stand the festival posts, where every long light he would watch another man's hands send up the show that had once been his. I had stood beside him for 3 years and never known. He had never said a word. He had watched the new crews come each summer, year on year, and held his peace, because it was not his place and not his post and not his to say. Until the night, a young man crossed 2 leads and canted a rack at a crowd, and the only thing in the whole kingdom standing between that crowd and a barge full of fire was a sentry that everyone, including me, had decided was just a man in a costume holding a rifle he'd never fired. He had not been mistaken about a single thing. The crossed leads shorted. The double charge lifted the tube. The canted rack threw its shell at the bank. He had read all of it at the 7th hour in the gold light and told them plainly and been laughed at, and then he had stood at his post being still the way a drawn bow is still, watching the one rack on the river he knew would fail, so that, when it failed, he was already moving. They brought him up the terrace stair smelling of smoke, his red scorched along one shoulder, his white gloves gray and burned through at the fingers, and the crowd that was left on the bank saw him come up out of the dark and understood, in the way a crowd understands things all at once, that this was the man, and they did the thing crowds do. They made a sound, a great rolling wave of it, and it was not a cheer exactly. It was something older and graver than a cheer. The king had come down from the box by then. He stood at the head of the stair and he did not say much, because the right thing to say in that moment is not many words, and he put his own hand on Havard's burned shoulder where the wool was scorched, and he held it there for a long moment in front of everyone, and that was enough, and the bank saw it, and the sound they made then I will hear until I die. Brennan was there too. I had wondered, watching it, what would happen to the young man at the panel, and I will tell you, because it is the part Havard cared about in the end, more than any of the rest of it. Brennan came to him, white-faced, 20 years older than he'd been at sunset, all the certainty burned out of him as completely as the fingers of Havard's gloves. He stood in front of the man he had called a statue and a costume and a soldier who should leave the clever part to people who understood it, and he could not find anything to say because there is nothing to say. And Havard, and this is the man, this is the whole of the man, did not say one cutting word to him. He had earned every one of them. He had 100,000 witnesses and the burned gloves to prove the right of them. He said none. What he said was, "You crossed 2 leads. It's the easiest mistake on the panel and the most dangerous, and you'll never make it again as long as you live, and neither will anyone you ever train. So go and teach it. That's the only thing worth doing with a night like this." A pause. And can't the angled work out over the water, every time? No exceptions, whatever the box wants to see. And Brennan, who had everything coming to him and got mercy instead, put out his hand, and the guardsman took it with a glove burned through to the skin, and that was the humbling, not a man destroyed in front of a crowd, but a man handed the one thing he had not earned and made better by it. I have thought about that more than I have thought about the fire. Anyone can ruin a fool who has it coming. It takes a particular kind of discipline to spend that right on something worth more. The company lost the contract, of course. That was decided above any of us and fairly. And the next long light and everyone since, the closing volley of the festival has been laid and fired by the Palace Fire Master's team again, by Master Crane, who took the bearskin off and the warrant back, and who never, to my knowledge, told the story of how he got it back, because in his telling there is no story, there is only a rack that was canted wrong and a man who happened to know it. But I was there. I stood beside him, and I will tell it for him, because somebody has to, and because of the one thing he said to me at the very end of that night that I have carried ever since. We were back on the empty terrace near dawn, the crowd long gone, the river quiet, the smell of smoke still on everything. He had his burned gloves off and was looking at his hands. I asked him the thing I'd been holding all night. I asked him why, in 3 years, he had never said a word, why a man who had given the kingdom its fire would put on a costume and stand still and watch other men do his work badly and hold his peace. He thought about it a while. Then he said, "Standing still isn't nothing, Daniel. People think it is. They think the man who isn't moving isn't doing anything." He looked out at the dark water and the smoking barge. "But the whole reason you stand still is so that you'll be standing there in the right place, watching the right thing on the one night out of 1,000 when somebody needs a man who already knew what was wrong before it went wrong. I stood my post for 3 years and nothing needed me. That's not waste, that's the job. The job is being ready for the night it isn't waste." He flexed his burned hand once, gently. "They asked what a sentry knows about fire. A sentry knows you don't put it out by being the loudest man at the panel. You put it out by being the one man who was watching the right rack." He picked up his bearskin off the wall, and he set it on his head, and he straightened the scorched red wool as well as it would straighten, and Master Crane of the Royal Fireworks went back to his post on the river terrace and stood still in the gray morning light, the way he had stood there 1,000 mornings, the way he would have stood there 1,000 more if no one had ever needed him. And now I knew, and the crew knew, and the king knew, and the whole bank knew exactly what that stillness had been holding back all along.